a world where myth and reality intertwine, there exists an inexhaustible wellspring of ancient Greek legends narrating timeless tales. These stories, passed down through generations for millennia, like faint echoes resonating from the marble halls of the past, continue to captivate minds. To immerse oneself in this world requires a particular state of mind. The day's hustle and bustle must dissipate like morning mist over the azure waters of the Aegean Sea, and the surroundings should foster tranquility, as if subdued light and soft background sounds create a portal to another reality. For these ancient narratives, in some inexplicable way, remain remarkably relatable and understandable, despite the passage of epochs. They invite everyone to journey to a land where majestic gods walked the earth alongside mortals, and each story held a kernel of profound truth, skillfully veiled in the shroud of wonder. On the rolling hills of ancient Sicily, where countless wildflowers bloomed, carpeting the earth like a vibrant tapestry, young Persephone spent her days engaged in an activity that, at first glance, might seem surprisingly mundane. She was gathering flowers, yet her movements lacked the haste or carelessness of someone plucking a dandelion from their own garden. Instead, Persephone glided across these meadows like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the delicate morning dew. She gracefully knelt among clusters of narcissi, whose pristine white petals shimmered in the first rays of the rising sun, and with extraordinary care selected only the most flawless specimens. Her woven basket gradually filled with hyacinths, roses and violets, each seemingly radiating its own inner luminescence. In that moment, the air was imbued with sweetness, an intoxicating blend of honey and fresh grass, the fragrance of a spring morning when everything felt new and full of boundless possibilities. Persephone's mother, the mighty Demeter, was revered as the goddess of the harvest, and their shared existence was inextricably linked to the world's prosperity. Together they bestowed upon the earth abundant blossoms and fertility. Their lives flowed in a serene rhythm, as predictable and comforting as the unchanging cycle of seasons, reliable, secure, and full of harmony. However, on that fateful morning, as Persephone, engrossed in her floral quest, carelessly strayed from familiar paths, her attention was drawn by something extraordinary. In a small, secluded clearing, a narcissus bloomed in solitary splendour, surpassing in size and beauty any flower the young goddess had ever seen. Its petals seemed to shimmer like precious pearls, and its enchanting fragrance beckoned her forward with such irresistible force, as if an invisible voice had called her name. Unbeknownst to Persephone, however, this enticing flower had been placed there with a specific intent. Its roots delved deep beneath the earth, into caverns so profound that not a single ray of sunlight ever touched their gloomy walls. In these silent depths reigned Hades, the lord of the underworld. He was not an embodiment of evil, as he is sometimes portrayed in certain tales, but rather the personification of overwhelming solitude. Imagine an endless eternity spent in a place where nothing grew, nothing changed, nothing lived. Such silence would be not merely quiet, but truly deafening, piercing to the very core of the soul. During his rare, fleeting visits to the upper world, Hades had observed Persephone on several occasions, watching her tend to her flowers with such tenderness and care, and something in his ancient, cold heart began to thaw. But how could the Lord of the Dead, the ruler of shadows, dare to court the daughter of the harvest, life itself personified? How could this gaping chasm between the radiance of life and the silence of death, between dazzling sunlight and impenetrable shadow, be bridged? This question remained unanswered, foreshadowing inevitable change. At the very moment Persephone bent down to pluck the extraordinary, alluring Narcissus, the ground beneath her feet suddenly trembled. At first it was merely a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, like a distant rumble of thunder or the dull thud of a passing carriage. But then, with a deafening screech, reminiscent of a giant ancient door creaking open, the earth itself split apart, and from its bottomless depths a chariot swiftly ascended, drawn by 4 black horses whose eyes blazed like distant stars in the night sky. Hades himself, the lord of the underworld, held the reins firmly, his dark cloak billowing behind him like a sombre banner. With one swift, inexorable movement he lifted Persephone into his chariot, and before she could even utter a single cry, they were already speeding back into the depths of the earth. The opening in the ground instantly closed behind them, as if it had never existed. The only silent witnesses to what had transpired were Persephone's scattered flowers and her overturned woven basket, lying forlornly in the morning grass. When Demeter, goddess of fertility, discovered her daughter's disappearance, her grief was truly immeasurable, beyond any comparison. It was a state of profound sorrow where the soul loses all desire for action, for maintaining the ordinary course of life. The urge to eat, to maintain order, to care for what once constituted the meaning of existence, vanished. But in Demeter's case, this sorrow manifested on such a grand scale that it affected the entire earth. She completely ceased caring for crops, halted the blessed rains, and no longer coaxed seeds to sprout with the arrival of spring. The world around them rapidly began to plunge into cold and barrenness. Leaves on trees yellowed and fell, but no new ones appeared. Grass withered, flowers died. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods, began to drop their fruit long before ripening, foreshadowing inevitable catastrophe. Meanwhile, in the depths of the underworld, entirely unexpected events were unfolding. Persephone, having overcome the initial shock and overwhelming fear, gradually began to notice astonishing things in her new, gloomy abode. The walls of Hades' palace were inlaid with countless precious gems that caught and reflected the meagre light in such a way as to create the illusion of a starry sky. Subterranean rivers flowed, emitting their own mysterious music, and in gardens where the soil was enriched with minerals from the very core of the earth, strange but uniquely beautiful flowers grew, unseen on the surface. Hades himself turned out to be not the monster Persephone had expected to see. He spoke softly, almost shyly, and his voice carried an unusual timidity for a lord of shadows. He brought her exquisite dishes she had never tasted before, fruits that grew only in the deepest recesses of the earth, incredibly sweet and unusual in flavour. He showed her the asphodel meadows, where the souls of ordinary mortals wandered in eternal, peaceful slumber, granting them rest. Hades never raised his voice, never demanded anything from her, but in every gesture, in every glance, there was a silent hope, a hope that Persephone would understand the depth of his loneliness and the true reason he had brought her to his realm. And yet, despite all the new discoveries, Persephone never ceased to yearn for the sun's radiance. She missed her mother, Demeter, and the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet, and the morning songs of birds filling the air with life. However alluring and amazing the underworld might be, it could not become her true home. Meanwhile, on the surface of the earth, the situation rapidly worsened, reaching a critical point. Without Demeter's nurturing hand, people began to suffer from famine, and other gods, seeing the impending disaster, implored her to restore fertility. But Demeter was unyielding. Her anger and grief were stronger than any pleas. "Return my daughter to me," she demanded, her voice ringing with an unbreakable resolve. "And then the world will bloom again, but not before." Finally, Zeus himself, the almighty king of the gods, was forced to intervene in the unfolding drama. He dispatched Hermes, the swift messenger god, to Hades' gloomy realm to mediate negotiations. Hermes found Hades and Persephone sitting in the silence of his underworld garden. No conversation passed between them. They simply existed in that strange, timeless state that grips beings trying to comprehend something deeply complex and painful. "She must return," Hermes said softly but firmly, addressing Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades nodded slowly, his gaze expressing deep understanding. He knew this moment was inevitable, but then turned to Persephone, and in his eyes was reflected all the sorrow of the earth's depths. "I understand," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But ask her, has she eaten anything while here?" This question seemed to carry more than just words, foreshadowing a fateful revelation. It was a question of immense importance, for there existed an ancient, unbreakable law. Anyone who tasted food in the underworld would forever be bound to it. Persephone slowly lowered her gaze to her hands, and recent events resurfaced in her mind. That morning, while strolling through Hades' mysterious garden, she had noticed a pomegranate tree heavy with fruit. These pomegranates were unlike any she had seen on the surface. Their skin was dark red, almost burgundy, and each seed inside shimmered like a tiny, precious gem. Almost without thinking, she picked one fruit and ate 7 of its seeds. Their taste was extraordinary, like a concentrated sweetness, the quintessence of all fruits ever grown, captured in a single moment. Just 7 seeds, such a seemingly insignificant detail, yet capable of irrevocably altering the fate of the entire world and her own. It was because of these 7 seeds that Persephone was unable to return permanently to the radiant upper world. However, Hermes, renowned for his eloquence and unparalleled skill in negotiation, managed to reach a compromise that was meant to reconcile both sides. According to the new agreement, for a portion of each year, 1 month for each seed eaten, Persephone would spend with Hades in the gloomy depths of the underworld. For the remaining months, she would be allowed to return to her mother, Demeter, and once again enjoy the world of sunshine and flourishing plants. And so it was decreed. When Persephone once again set foot on the surface of the earth, Demeter's joy was so immense and all-encompassing that flowers instantly bloomed wherever her beloved daughter's feet trod. Spring arrived like an explosion of cheerful laughter, followed by a bountiful summer, filled with abundant growth and warming heat. But when it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld, Demeter's inconsolable grief brought with it autumn, when leaves changed their vibrant hues to crimson and gold, then fell, and winter, when the entire world plunged into deep slumber beneath silent blankets of snow. Legends say that in the underworld, Persephone not only accepted her fate, but also became its full queen. She mastered the art of helping Hades justly judge the souls of the dead, and her wisdom became an integral part of governing the realm of shadows. She tended to mysterious subterranean gardens where flowers grew, unseen by any living person, their beauty different but no less captivating. And gradually, step by step, she grew fond of this quiet, thoughtful god who had so dramatically and irrevocably changed her life, yet always treated her with extraordinary tender respect, allowing her to find her own strength and dignity. With the return of spring each year, Persephone would again rise from the earth, like the very first blossoms, carrying with her echoes of the depths and the memory of darkness that made the radiance of sunlight even more precious. And Demeter would greet her daughter with such all-encompassing joy that the entire world celebrated her return with the exuberant blooming of trees, the jubilant singing of birds, and the intoxicating scent of fresh grass. Even millennia later, this ancient drama continues to unfold in the unchanging cycle of seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to change their hues, Persephone prepares for her return to her underworld realm. Every winter, bare branches and dormant seeds await, like Demeter, the rebirth of spring. And when the first crocus pushes through the still melting snow, it is seen as Persephone's very return home, heralding renewal and hope. This phenomenon makes one ponder the unseen connections between the world of gods and the world of humans. What other old stories might be hidden in the daily rhythms of the world around us? What mysteries do the seasons themselves continue to narrate, if only we listen to their silent language? Continuing our thoughts on the narratives hidden within everyday phenomena, we should recall a widely known expression. It is often heard how someone is characterized as having an Achilles heel. This phrase is used to describe a situation where a person, despite their immense strength or outstanding talents, possesses a single yet critical weakness. The story behind these words is rooted in deep feelings of maternal love and a desperate attempt to protect a child from a predetermined fate that she could not even imagine. This tale, full of drama and sacrifice, awaits its turn to be told. Thetis, mistress of the ocean depths, appeared as a being of unearthly beauty and profound wisdom. Her hair cascaded like flowing ocean waves, and her eyes held a mysterious shimmer, reflecting the silent eternity of underwater grottos. Having joined her destiny with an earthly ruler, King Peleus, and given birth to a son, she enveloped this child in an all-consuming fierce love, that same instinctive protection that burns in mothers' hearts through the ages. However, being a divine being, Thetis possessed the gift of foresight, and the visions revealed to her filled her soul with unspeakable horror. She was fated to learn that her son, named Achilles, was destined to become the greatest of all warriors who ever walked the earth. He would be swift like a gust of wind, mighty like an untamed storm, and unsurpassed in the art of wielding sword and spear, exceeding any mortal fighter. Songs and legends would be composed about his heroic deeds for millennia. But beneath this glory lay a terrible truth. He would perish in the prime of his life, struck down on the battlefield before he could taste the full cup of life. One can only imagine Thetis, cradling her tiny son, feeling his delicate fingers barely clench her hand and trembling as she watched him sleep, serene and perfect, as only infants are. How could she, a goddess and a mother, accept the inevitability that this precious child was destined for such a short and merciless fate? Her heart refused to reconcile with such injustice. She knew she had to make a desperate attempt to alter his predetermined destiny. And so, on one silent night, when the royal palace was deep in slumber, and even the usually talkative owls had fallen quiet, Thetis carefully wrapped her infant in the softest swaddling clothes and headed with him to the banks of the Styx. This was not merely a body of water, it was the river that served as the unbreakable boundary between the world of the living and the gloomy domain of the dead. Its waters, shrouded in ancient mysteries, possessed an extraordinary, almost divine power. Legend held that anyone who bathed in these mystical waters would gain invulnerability, becoming impervious to all harm and untouched by all woes. The river, whose waters were black as midnight, surprisingly exuded warmth, flowing silently, like a stream of liquid quiet, shrouded in mystery. Thetis patiently waited until the river's surface reached her waist, and then, holding her breath and whispering pleas to any deities who might hear her desperate call, she immersed her son in these enchanting waters. However, when holding such a fragile creature, extreme caution is required. One must hold him firmly so he does not slip from one's grasp. Thetis held Achilles by his tiny heel, her fingers tightly encircling his delicate ankle. And so it happened that the waters of the Styx washed over every part of the infant's body, except for that single tiny area where his mother's hand served as his shield, protecting him from the touch of the magical river. When she drew him from the dark waters, the infant Achilles was no longer entirely a mortal being. His skin had transformed, becoming like an unbreakable armor, capable of deflecting any weapon, be it a deadly blade or a sharp spearhead. No sword could cleave his flesh, no arrow could pierce his body, no spear could wound him. Thetis believed she had saved her son, or at least so it seemed to her at that moment. Achilles, as ancient prophecies foretold, grew into a true embodiment of strength and valor. He was tall and mighty, his golden hair like ripe wheat fields under the summer sun, catching every ray of light. He could race faster than the swiftest horses, fight on the battlefield longer than any other warrior, and his masterful command of weapons resembled deadly, yet mesmerizing poetry. The moment he stepped onto the battlefield, enemy ranks would flee like autumn leaves driven by an untamed hurricane. However, beneath the image of the invincible warrior lay another facet of his nature. He showed surprising kindness to those weaker than him, was unswervingly loyal to his comrades, and, surprisingly for such a fierce fighter, possessed extraordinary tenderness. Achilles played the lyre with virtuosity, composing inspiring songs about heroes of bygone eras. He deeply grieved for his comrades and was not ashamed to openly mourn them when they were wounded or fell in battle. In another world, his name might have been remembered not only for his unparalleled valor, but also for the boundless compassion that resided in his heart. When the Trojan War erupted, a monumental conflict that stretched for a full decade, all the greatest heroes of Hellas, renowned for their glory, set forth, crossing the boundless wine-dark sea to engage in battle. Achilles, of course, was among them, leading his own contingent of valiant warriors known as the Myrmidons. Their loyalty to their leader was boundless, not only because of his invincibility in combat, but also because he treated them with genuine respect, sharing all the hardships and privations of military life. For 9 long years, Achilles was the embodiment of that invincible warrior they had envisioned. He participated in countless battles, emerging unharmed time and again, while his opponents fell around him like ripe wheat under the scythe. His fame grew like a mighty tree, until the mere mention of his name began to sow confusion and make enemy armies falter, sensing inevitable defeat. But then something happened that exposed another side of Achilles, the part of him capable of the deepest emotions. His closest companion and friend Patroclus fell in battle at the hand of Hector, Troy's greatest warrior. Patroclus was more than just a friend to Achilles, he was like a brother, the only one who truly understood Achilles' heart, hidden beneath his invulnerable skin. Achilles' grief overwhelmed him like a furious force of nature. He wept so piercingly that his mother, Thetis, heard his lamentations from her underwater palace. He refused food and sleep. As a sign of mourning, he cut his magnificent golden hair and cast it onto Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, consumed by a rage that was in fact a twisted, inverted love, he hunted down Hector and challenged him to a mortal duel. The duel between Achilles and Hector was like watching a furious storm battle a mighty mountain. Both warriors possessed incomparable skill and were undeniably brave, but only one of them was protected by the magical waters of the Styx. Hector fought with exceptional valor, but ultimately Achilles' spear inexorably found its mark, and Troy's greatest defender fell, slain. Achilles' subsequent actions revealed both his deeply human heart and his immense, horrifying grief. Instead of honoring Hector's body as befitted a worthy opponent, he tied it to his chariot and dragged it around the impregnable walls of Troy. This act of desecration profoundly shocked both armies and incurred the wrath of the Olympian gods themselves. For several days Achilles continued this grim, cruel ritual, driving his chariot around the city walls while Hector's family watched in horror from the battlements. It seemed that by punishing Hector's lifeless body, he was somehow attempting to avenge death itself for mercilessly taking his friend. But in the end, Hector's father, the aged King Priam, performed an act that required far greater courage than any audacious attack on the battlefield. He appeared alone in Achilles' tent in the middle of the night, completely unarmed and unguarded, to plead for the return of his son's body. The old man knelt before the warrior who had taken his child's life and spoke to him not as a ruler to an enemy, but as a father to another human capable of understanding the depth of loss. "I have done what no mortal has done," Priam said softly. "I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in these words pierced Achilles' shroud of anger and grief, reaching his heart. He looked at this elderly man, bowed by sorrow, and in his image saw his own father, who would one day grieve for him in the same way. Then Achilles wept, but these were no longer angry tears of fury, but cleansing tears of shared human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam and declared a temporary truce, so that Troy could mourn its hero with dignity. This was one of the most noble moments in Achilles' life, showing that even the greatest warrior, deep down, remained merely human, capable of responding to the call of compassion. However, the war continued, and relentless fate did not forget its claim on Achilles. During the final fierce battles at the walls of Troy, as he fought with his usual skill and fearlessness, an arrow flew towards him. It was shot by Paris, Hector's brother, better known for his beauty than his martial prowess. Under normal circumstances, such an arrow would have harmlessly bounced off Achilles' invulnerable skin. But this arrow, guided by the will of the god Apollo, found the only vulnerable spot on Achilles' entire body, his heel, the very spot where his mother's fingers had protected him from the touch of the waters of the Styx. It was such a tiny target, such an improbable wound, but it was enough. The greatest warrior of all time fell because of his heel, the only place where his mother's protective touch had left him mortal. In her desperate attempt to save her son from his predetermined fate, Thetis inadvertently created the very weakness that ultimately destroyed him. Dying, Achilles reflected not on his countless victories or the eternal glory that awaited his name through the ages, but on simple, everyday things. The sensation of warm sunlight on his face, the ringing laughter of his loyal friend Patroclus, the melodies of songs he never had time to finish composing. He thought of his mother and hoped she would understand. He had tried to live his life in a way that honored the gift of being she had given him, even if he could not make that life as long as she had wished. The tale of Achilles serves as an eternal reminder that our greatest strengths and our deepest vulnerabilities often spring from a single source, from the love of those who genuinely care for us. All protection has its limits, and every gift carries its price. Sometimes what gives us power simultaneously makes us fragile. Even today, when we mention someone's Achilles heel, we unwittingly recall this ancient truth. Everyone, however mighty they may seem, has that tiny spot where the arrows of fate can mercilessly strike. Perhaps it is not a weakness at all, but merely an inherent part of what makes us truly human. However, the arrows of fate that struck Achilles were far from the only ones capable of forever changing the course of history. Sometimes love itself, that all-consuming emotion, can turn into the most dangerous of all arrows. This was what a young musician named Orpheus was about to discover on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Orpheus was gifted with a talent that surpassed all ordinary human skill, bordering on the divine. When he touched the strings of his lyre and began to sing, flowers would suddenly bloom, defying the change of seasons. Rivers seemed to alter their ancient courses, striving to draw closer to the source of his enchanting music. Wild beasts, forgetting their natural enmity, would sit peacefully side by side, mighty lions near gentle lambs, predatory hawks beside defenseless mice. All listened to his melodies with the same dreamy bliss that overtakes a person upon hearing a beloved lullaby. Even ancient trees, tearing their roots from the earth, would slowly move, seeking to draw nearer to hear him play. Imagine you wander through a forest and see ancient oaks moving unhurriedly, like gigantic yet gentle giants, their leaves rustling in time with a distant, mesmerizing melody. Such was the unimaginable power of Orpheus's music. It transformed the impossible into the natural, and the magical into the mundane. When Orpheus became enamored with Eurydice, a forest nymph whose gaze was like clear spring water, and whose ringing laughter resembled the chime of bells, his musical creation seemed to acquire even greater depth and expressiveness. He wove musical tapestries that reflected the play of sunlight in the strands of her dark hair. Rhythmic patterns echoed her graceful glide across green meadows, and harmonic combinations embodied all the inexplicable charm he felt, even just observing her tending to wounded birds or gathering wild honey nectar. Her presence became an inexhaustible source of inspiration for the great singer. Their wedding day was perfect in the sense that it inspired faith in the inherent goodness of the universe. The ceremony took place in a picturesque grove where wildflowers seemed to form perfect circles on their own, as if nature itself had joined the celebration. Orpheus performed a melody he had composed exclusively for this momentous occasion, and as his voice soared and gently descended, fluttering butterflies circled the lovers like living confetti, filling the air with a magic and lightness. At the conclusion of the celebration, as the sun began to set and the festivities gave way to that peaceful exhaustion that typically follows a perfectly spent day, Eurydice decided to stroll through the blooming meadow. She wished to spend a few moments in solitude, to fully absorb the joy, to let it settle deep into her heart, much like honey permeates warm bread. She walked barefoot on the soft grass, still adorned with her wedding wreath of wild roses, when she accidentally stepped on something that suddenly stirred beneath her foot. It was a snake, disturbed in its evening repose, which sank its venomous fangs into her ankle. Thus, in an instant, serene happiness turned into unspeakable tragedy. Eurydice barely managed to whisper Orpheus's name before collapsing lifelessly among the very flowers that, moments ago, had witnessed her happiness. When Orpheus finally reached her, rushing to her call, life had already left her. Her hand still retained warmth in his embrace, and her facial features remained serene. However, all that constituted the essence of her personality, her uniqueness, her sparkling laughter, her gentle teasing, her habit of quietly humming along to his playing, all of it had vanished without a trace, like morning mist under the sun's rays, leaving behind only desolation. For 7 days and 7 nights Orpheus remained by Eurydice's lifeless body, pouring out his grief in songs so heart-wrenching that even silent stones seemed to shed tears. His musical art had always held sway over the natural world, but now it expressed a pain so pure and profound that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of existence. Others present, sharing his sorrow, implored him to eat, to find some sleep, to distract himself from his grief long enough to care for himself. Yet Orpheus was unable to do so. How could one eat when the one who filled life with meaning was gone? How could one surrender to sleep when one's dreams were filled with music that could never again be shared? His despair was boundless. Eventually a thought sparked in his mind. This idea was so desperate and fraught with such danger that only one maddened by grief would dare to attempt it. He resolved to journey to the very realm of the dead and persuade Hades to return Eurydice to life. No living person had ever successfully entered the realm of the dead and returned safely. It was an unprecedented undertaking, defying the very nature of existence. However, Orpheus possessed his musical gift, and music, as is known, had always been capable of working the impossible. The path to the underworld was hidden in a cavern so profound that the sun's rays never reached its distant depths. As Orpheus descended, drawing melodies from his lyre, as if lighting his way with sound, the familiar noises of the underworld gradually subsided. The agonizing moans of damned souls, the rushing waters of the river Styx, the grinding of gigantic gates, all fell silent to listen to his song. The gloomy atmosphere of the underworld seemed to soften under the influence of his art. Even Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed hound that tirelessly guarded the gates of the dead, lay down and whimpered softly as Orpheus continued to play. The 3 pairs of eyes of this monster, usually burning with eternal vigilance, dulled and drooped, like a sleeping puppy's. When Orpheus finally appeared before the majestic thrones of Hades and Persephone, he performed the most significant song of his life. His song told of a love capable of transcending death itself, of the unbearable pain of separation, of a world that had lost its harmony when Eurydice was taken from it. His melody was so beautiful, so filled with genuine sorrow and all-encompassing love, that Hades, the lord of the underworld, shed tears for the first time in all eternity. Even the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose hearts seemed harder than stone, found their cheeks wet with tears they could not recall ever shedding. Orpheus's music pierced the hardest hearts of the underworld. Persephone, who, more than anyone, understood what it meant to be torn from the world of the living, leaned over and whispered something in her husband's ear. Hades slowly nodded in response, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, like any mortal overcome by strong emotions. "Your music has moved our hearts," Hades said, his voice unexpectedly gentle, with a hint of compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you. However, there is one condition. You must leave the underworld walking ahead of her, and you must not look back until both of you are under the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before that moment, she will be lost to you forever." The condition was strict and allowed for no exceptions. At first glance, the condition seemed simple enough. Orpheus had already managed to find his way into the underworld, and surely he was confident he could find his way back out. He nodded eagerly in agreement, already vividly imagining the moment he and Eurydice would emerge into daylight and begin their life together anew, free from the gloom of the underworld. Hope filled his heart. The return journey began with a sense of joyful anticipation. Behind him, Orpheus clearly heard Eurydice's familiar footsteps, the soft sound of her breathing, and the gentle rustle of her wedding dress against the stone. At times she would hum softly along to the melodies he played to light their way, and that sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. However, as they ascended higher, and the path grew steeper and more winding, doubts began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed so faint. What if he was only imagining them? What if Hades had tricked him, and he was climbing alone while Eurydice remained below? What if she was struggling to keep up, growing tired, falling behind? The closer they came to the surface, the more these anxieties consumed him, turning into an unbearable psychological ordeal. He began to slow his pace, straining to hear any sign that she was still there. Once, when the path was particularly difficult, he heard her stumble slightly, and he had to grip his lyre tightly to keep from turning to help her, honouring his promise. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of ascent, Orpheus saw something that made his heart leap with joy. Ahead, a thin sliver of sunlight appeared, marking the exit from the cavern. They were almost free. Only a few more steps separated them from the world of the living. But as he approached this saving line of light, the doubts that had gnawed at him reached their peak. The footsteps behind him had grown so faint he could barely discern them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the shadowy realm behind them? What if she needed his help to cross this final, crucial threshold? An internal struggle tore at him, at the very moment his own feet touched the sunlight. Just one step before Eurydice would have been completely safe. Orpheus turned around. For one perfect, heartbreaking instant he saw her. She was there, as beautiful as ever, reaching out towards the light and towards him. But she was still one step inside the boundary of the underworld, and by looking back, Orpheus broke the condition of her release, dooming them both to eternal separation. A tragic mistake, made at the very last moment. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered, and her voice was full of deep sadness, but not anger. She understood that he had turned, driven by his love for her, not because he doubted her presence, but that understanding could not change the irreversible consequences. She vanished like morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply disappeared, returned to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus closed, like water closing over a dropped stone, forever separating their worlds. Orpheus spent the rest of his life composing songs dedicated to love and irreparable loss, to the terrifying space that stretches between hope and despair. His music became more beautiful than ever before, but it was also imbued with a profound sadness, carrying the bitter knowledge that some mistakes cannot be undone, some chances cannot be repeated. He never again attempted to return to the underworld. Perhaps he realized that Hades' mercy could not be sought twice, or perhaps he understood that some sorrows must simply be borne, transformed into something else through the alchemy of time and acceptance, into an eternal melody of grief and remembrance. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as an eternal reminder that love sometimes demands impossible acts from us, such as moving forward without looking back, trusting what is unseen, believing in promises that seem too good to be true. And sometimes, even when we fail in these impossible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of music that echoes through the world long after we are gone, continuing to inspire and caution. Sometimes the echoes of ancient stories penetrate our time in the most unexpected ways. Just as Orpheus's music lived on after his passing, so too does the whisper of a magnificent city, presumed to have vanished beneath the waves long before recorded history, persist. The philosopher Plato first recounted the story of Atlantis in his writings, describing it as a place that existed 9,000 years before his own time. Whether it was historical fact or a kind of thought experiment about the rise and fall of civilizations, we may never know, may never. However, the story he told was so vivid, so detailed, that people have since relentlessly searched for Atlantis, striving to uncover the mystery of this lost world. According to Plato's descriptions, Atlantis was located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the area we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The island surpassed Libya and Asia combined in size. It was arranged in a series of concentric circles where rings of land alternated with rings of water, like a target skillfully carved from earth and sea. At the very center of these circles rose the most beautiful city imaginable, an architectural marvel of its time. Structures were built from black, white and red stone quarried on the island itself, and many were faced with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which emitted a warm golden glow, lending the city unparalleled brilliance and grandeur. At the very heart of the city rose a palace, a magnificent example of engineering and artistic mastery. Its majestic walls were faced with shimmering silver, and its spires and domes gleamed with pure gold. Within this grand edifice was a temple dedicated to Poseidon, the mighty lord of the seas, who, according to ancient traditions, was considered the progenitor of Atlantis' first king. The exterior of the temple was entirely covered in silver, save for its pinnacles, which shone with a dazzling golden luster. The interior of the temple was adorned with a colossal statue of Poseidon himself, depicted as a charioteer taming 6 winged horses. This magnificent sculpture was so tall that the god's head nearly touched the vaulted ceiling of the vast hall. However, perhaps even more striking than the city's external beauty was its exceptional sophistication. The inhabitants of Atlantis had developed an intricately designed system of hot and cold springs that continuously supplied water for their luxurious and multi-tiered baths. They built harbours capable of sheltering ships arriving from all corners of the known world. Moreover, the Atlanteans achieved unprecedented heights in agriculture, allowing their fertile island to yield 2 harvests a year. The people of Atlantis traced their lineage back to Poseidon himself, and for many generations his descendants retained a portion of their divine essence. They were characterized by wisdom, justice, and moderation in their desires, preferring virtue to material wealth and valuing wisdom above the thirst for power. Their laws were inscribed on majestic pillars of orichalcum, and their kings gathered alternately every 5 and 6 years to address matters of state and administer justice throughout their vast kingdom. For countless generations, Atlantis prospered under this wise system. Their ships traversed distant seas, enriching themselves with knowledge and valuable goods, and spreading their unique inventions. The Atlanteans possessed profound knowledge in scientific fields that were completely unknown to other civilizations. They meticulously studied celestial bodies and their movements, understood the laws of metallurgy, and mastered the art of agronomy, allowing them to grow plants in conditions that other peoples would have deemed impossible. However, as centuries passed, significant changes occurred in the moral character of the Atlanteans. The original divine fire, their gift from Poseidon, gradually faded with each new generation, diluted by gradual mixing with humankind, and perhaps the corrupting influence of excessive abundance and continuous prosperity. Where once they were content with moderation, they now began to crave exorbitant wealth and luxury. Where they once valued wisdom highly, they now favoured cunning. Where they once showed generosity to foreigners and neighbouring peoples, they became greedy and aggressive possessors. This moral transformation occurred slowly, like the gradual fading of day at sunset, so imperceptibly that one might not notice its beginning until suddenly realizing that the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The Atlanteans turned their gaze beyond the borders of their own fertile island, and now saw not potential allies and trading partners, but lands to be conquered and peoples destined for subjugation. They formed a formidable army and set out to conquer the Mediterranean region. Their advanced technologies and refined military strategy rendered them almost completely invulnerable, and one after another, ancient polis and mighty kingdoms bowed before their crushing onslaught. But when the Atlanteans approached the walls of Athens, the future cradle of philosophy and Plato's homeland, they met with stubborn and completely unexpected resistance. The ancient Athenians, though vastly outnumbered and technologically inferior, fought with the desperate resolve of people defending their homes, and with the righteous anger of those who rejected tyrannical subjugation. Against all odds, Athens not only repelled the Atlantean aggression, but launched a counter-offensive that drove the ill-fated invaders back across the sea. It seemed that the courage and high moral qualities that the Atlanteans had irrevocably lost had, by some miracle, taken root in Athenian soil. But the true judgment on Atlantis was not delivered by mortal adversaries, but sent down by the Celestials themselves. The supreme god Zeus, looking down from the heights of Olympus, beheld the profound fall of the once noble Atlanteans, transformed into greedy, warlike, and morally corrupt beings. He made an unyielding decision. Such a civilization had forfeited its right to continued existence. The catastrophe struck within a single day. Powerful earthquakes shook the island with such force that majestic buildings crumbled into ruins like fragile sandcastles. Fiery volcanic eruptions filled the air with clouds of ash and flame. But the most devastating event was the rising sea that swallowed the land. The famous concentric rings, symbols of Atlantis's grandeur, transformed into gigantic whirlpools, mercilessly dragging ships, structures, and people to the bottom. The Grand Palace, the Sanctuary of Poseidon, the vast libraries holding centuries of wisdom, the bustling harbours that served as havens for ships from all corners of the world, all vanished, plunged into the abyss as the waves closed over the island, like the pages of a closing book. With the dawn of a new day, nothing remained but a boundless expanse of water. The sea in that region became completely unnavigable, choked with thick mud raised from the seabed. Ships that dared to sail through these waters became mired in a substance resembling liquid earth, and seafarers testified that this area remained impassable for navigation for many generations thereafter. This legend could have ended there, consigned to oblivion like countless tales of divine retribution and human folly. Yet something about the story of Atlantis captivated the human imagination, in a way no purely historical account of lost cities has managed. Perhaps it was the thought that such a highly advanced civilization could simply vanish overnight. Or perhaps it was the alluring prospect that somewhere in the ocean depths, the ruins of this glorious city still lay, awaiting discovery. Through centuries, scholars, adventurers, and romantics relentlessly searched for Atlantis in the most diverse corners of the planet, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Caribbean Sea to Antarctica. Some claim to have found evidence in mysterious underwater structures near the coast of Bimini. Others hypothesized that Atlantis was merely an echo of memories of the Minoan civilization of Crete, destroyed by a powerful volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. However, perhaps the true geographical location is not the key aspect. It is likely that Atlantis is not so much a physical place, discoverable with ships and diving equipment, as it is an idea, constantly regenerating in the human consciousness. It is the notion of an ideal society that destroyed itself through its own triumph. It is the image of a civilization that rose to such dizzying heights that it forgot the fundamental values that originally elevated it. Whenever human society becomes filled with excessive pride, overconfidence in its own superiority, and an excessive willingness to impose its will on others through force, the ghost of Atlantis invisibly whispers a warning. Whenever we observe the development of technologies and prosperity devoid of wisdom and moderation, we unwittingly contemplate the very conditions that are presumed to have caused the demise of the most advanced civilization that ever existed on Earth. Perhaps this is why humanity continues its search for Atlantis, not only in the bottomless depths of the sea, but also in the cycles of rise and fall of civilizations throughout historical record. these searches continue, for we invariably recreate its image. And we need to constantly remind ourselves that the true price of greatness is profound humility, so as not to forget our origins and the true meaning of the path that was chosen. The pursuit of lost grandeur often entails more courage than prudence. This was a lesson young Prince Jason learned firsthand when he embarked on a quest for an immeasurable treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His daring expedition led him to the very edges of the known world, accompanied by a host of heroes whose names still echo in the annals of ancient legends. The narrative of Jason opens with an act of familial betrayal, much like many ancient tales. His cunning uncle Peleus usurped the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father. When Jason reached manhood, he returned to claim his rightful inheritance. But the treacherous and ruthless Peleus made Jason an offer that, at first glance, seemed magnanimous, but was in fact cleverly designed to permanently remove him from the path. "I will gladly hand over the reins of power to you," Peleus declared with a feigned smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "But first, you must prove your valor by performing a truly great feat. Bring me the golden fleece from distant Colchis, and then the kingdom will be yours." The golden fleece was the possession of a mythical ram that had once carried 2 children to safety on its back, soaring through the air with the lightness of a bird. When this ram was sacrificed to the Olympian gods, its fleece, shining like the sun itself, was hung in a sacred grove in the remote kingdom of Colchis, on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. However, the fleece did not simply rest there, waiting to be plucked like ripe fruit. It was guarded by a dragon that knew no sleep, never closed its eyes, and never for a moment relaxed its vigilant watch. This was not the monstrous dragon typically featured in folk tales, huge, fire-breathing, dramatic in its terrifying power. This dragon was far more terrifying, for it possessed boundless patience, a subtle mind, and absolute devotion to its mission. The colossal dragon coiled around the mighty oak where the fleece rested, its scaly hide shimmering, changing hues depending on the light, sometimes appearing golden, like the fleece itself, sometimes darkening, blending with the shadows among the leaves. Its keen eyes, like polished amber, tirelessly watched for the slightest movement in the sacred grove with the focused attention of a predator granted all the time in the world. To reach Colchis, Jason required a ship and a crew brave enough to venture into uncharted waters, teeming with monsters, inhabited by hostile tribes, and fraught with navigational hazards that had already claimed countless vessels before their arrival. Therefore, he ordered a ship to be built, named the Argo, and issued a call to heroes to join him in an undertaking that, by all accounts, was likely to be a journey of no return. The response exceeded all expectations. Valiant heroes from all corners of Hellas flocked to join those who would later be known as the Argonauts. Among them was Heracles, the mighty hero, strongest of all mortals, capable of wrestling fierce lions and altering river courses. Orpheus was present, whose enchanting music could subdue wild beasts and even bring tears to stones. Also came the twins Castor and Pollux, masters of horsemanship and boxing, and Atalanta, a fearless huntress who could outrun any man and whose arrows never missed their mark. The heroes who embarked on this great journey were driven by diverse motivations. Some sought shining glory, others craved unknown adventures. There were those who sought escape from difficult situations at home, and others pursued dreams they could not fully grasp themselves. But despite all their differences, each of them profoundly understood the upcoming voyage would test them in ways they had never known before. The journey to Colchis stretched for many months, and each segment of it was an adventure in itself. They navigated the treacherous straits of Scylla and Charybdis, where colossal rocks periodically clashed, crushing any ship caught between them. They encountered harpies, vicious creatures with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, who relentlessly tormented a wise old king, constantly stealing his food. They landed on islands whose inhabitants had never before seen foreigners. And to continue their journey, they had to resort to diplomacy as often as force. Sometimes the locals were hostile, sometimes helpful, but always they were consumed by curiosity towards these heroes who had travelled so far from their native shores on such a perilous mission. When the ship Argo finally docked in Colchis, King Aeetes received Jason and his companions with the wary courtesy that rulers typically show to guests who could be either valuable allies or serious threats. The monarch agreed to give Jason the Golden Fleece, but only on the condition that he could complete a series of seemingly impossible tasks. First, Jason had to yoke 2 bronze bulls that breathed fire and had hooves of copper. Then, using these monstrous creatures, he was to plough a field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth, armed warriors would sprout, whom Jason was obliged to defeat before sunset. This trial was undoubtedly designed for his demise, and everyone understood this perfectly. The bronze bulls had already trampled and burned every previous daredevil. The warriors growing from dragon's teeth were known for their ferocity, impeccable coordination, and absolute ruthlessness. It was expected that no mortal could survive such trials. However, Jason gained an unexpected ally. Medea, the king's daughter, skilled in magical arts and herbal lore. She had observed Jason since his arrival in Colchis, and something in his courage and evident dedication to his cause touched her heart. Medea was not a typical princess awaiting rescue. She possessed a sharp mind, powerful strength, and a deep understanding of forces most people feared even to contemplate. Her magic could both heal and harm, protect and destroy, and she decided to use it to aid this foreign prince who had sailed so far to accomplish what everyone deemed impossible. She gave Jason a magical ointment that would protect him from the bulls' fiery breath and the blows of their bronze hooves. She revealed to him the secret to defeating the dragon-tooth warriors. Throw a stone into their midst, so they would begin to fight each other instead of him. And, most importantly, she promised to help him get past the sleepless dragon guarding the Golden Fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had predicted. Protected by her ointment, Jason was able to yoke the bronze bulls and plough the field. When the armed warriors sprang from the furrows, he threw a stone into their dense ranks, and they immediately began to fight among themselves with such furious intensity that they completely destroyed each other. King Aeetes was furious when he learned of Jason's success, but he could not renege on his public promise. Nevertheless, he had no intention of actually giving up the Golden Fleece. He began to devise plans to attack the Argonauts at night, to kill them all while they slept. Medea, who understood her father's thoughts better than anyone, warned Jason of the impending betrayal. That same night she led him to the sacred grove, where the golden fleece hung on the oak, guarded by the dragon that never knew sleep. The dragon sensed their approach long before they reached the tree. Its enormous head rose from the coils of its body, and its amber eyes stared at them with malevolent intelligence. It made no sound. It did not roar or hiss like lesser creatures. Its threat lay in its absolute stillness, its patient readiness to strike. Medea began to sing, a song in a language older than Greek, perhaps older than any human tongue. It was a lullaby that appealed to the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, the parts that remembered what it was like to be small and safe, and cradled in loving arms. The dragon's head began to sway slightly, as if it were fighting something it had never experienced before. Its amber eyes, which had never closed, began to grow heavy. The coils of its body loosened, as muscles that had been tense for decades finally began to relax. For the first time in its long existence, the sleepless dragon began to sleep. Jason climbed the oak as quietly as possible, barely daring to breathe as he reached for the golden fleece. When his fingers touched it, the fleece was warm, as if it still carried the life of the magical ram from which it came. It was surprisingly light and seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. With the fleece securely tucked under his arm, Jason descended and followed Medea out of the grove. Behind them, the dragon slept, lost in dreams that no creature before it had ever been able to experience. The journey home was as perilous as the journey there, now complicated by the fact that King Aeetes had sent ships in pursuit to reclaim his daughter and kill the thieves who had stolen his treasure. But that is another story entirely, full of its own adventures and heartaches. What is important now is that Jason had accomplished what everyone believed impossible. He had obtained the golden fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that never rested, never lowered its guard, never gave anyone the slightest opportunity to approach. Sometimes the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by force or cunning, but by offering it something it has never had, in this case, the simple gift of sleep. The rest that every living creature needs, but which this dragon was deprived of by the nature of its duty. This makes one wonder what other seemingly impossible tasks can be accomplished, not by fighting harder or being smarter, but by understanding what the guardian truly needs and finding a way to provide it. Understanding what drives us to undertake impossible tasks. Heracles knew better than anyone, though his understanding came at a cost that nearly destroyed him. His story reminds us that sometimes our greatest strengths and our deepest flaws stem from the same source, and that redemption often demands far more from us than we think we can bear. Heracles was born with strength that surpassed all mortal capabilities. As an infant, he strangled 2 snakes sent to kill him in his cradle, and he did so laughing as if it were a game. As he grew, his strength grew with him, until he could lift boulders that would challenge a dozen ordinary men. He could wrestle lions bare-handed, could bend iron bars as easily as you might bend a flower stem. But along with this immense physical strength came a temper that was just as powerful and far more dangerous. When Heracles grew angry, he didn't just raise his voice or storm out of a room as most people do. His rage was like a force of nature, sudden, overwhelming, and infinitely destructive. For many years, Heracles managed this aspect of his nature. He married a woman named Megara, and they had children. It seemed he had found the peaceful domestic life that might tame the wildness in his heart. He was a loving father, gentle with his children despite his immense strength, and a devoted husband who strove every day to be worthy of his family's trust. But the goddess Hera, who had hated Heracles since his birth because he was the son of her husband Zeus by another woman, decided to shatter this happiness in the cruelest way possible. She inflicted a fit of madness upon Heracles, a rage so complete that he lost all sense of who he was and what he was doing. When the madness finally receded, Heracles found himself surrounded by a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his insane fury, he had killed his own wife and children, the very people he loved most in the world. His strength, which should have been used to protect them, became the instrument of their destruction. The grief and guilt that followed nearly annihilated him. For several days he sat amidst the ruins of his former happiness, unable to eat, sleep, or even speak. How could he live with the knowledge that he had destroyed everything he held dear? How could he continue to exist when the very thing he feared most about himself had proven to be absolutely true? Finally, desperate to find a way to atone for his deeds, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's prophecy was harsh, but offered a thread of hope. Heracles was to serve his cowardly cousin, King Eurystheus, for 12 years, performing whatever labours the king demanded. Only by fulfilling this service could he find purification from his terrible crime. Over the great hero Heracles, by fate or destiny, fell the power of King Eurystheus, a personality who, as one might easily foresee, turned out to be quite mediocre and even repulsive. This ruler was not only petty and envious, but also openly cruel. However, despite his vices, Eurystheus possessed enough shrewdness to recognize the potential threat posed by Heracles' extraordinary power. His cowardice prevented him from using this strength for good. Instead, he obsessively desired its destruction. These motives prompted Eurystheus to devise a series of 12 grand labours. Each of these deeds was initially conceived as impossible, with the sole purpose of destroying Heracles in one of many sophisticated and agonizing ways. If, by some miracle, the hero managed to survive one task, the next, in the king's design, was intended to be an even more lethal challenge. As his first trial, Heracles was commanded to slay the Nemean lion. This monstrous creature possessed a hide of such exceptional toughness that no weapon could pierce it. Arrows shot at it bounced off like small pebbles, swords shattered against its thick fur, and sharp spears crumbled upon impact. Ultimately, Heracles had no choice but to strangle the beast with his own bare hands. This exhausting struggle lasted throughout the entire day, leaving the hero depleted but undeniably triumphant. The second trial involved the extermination of the Linnaean Hydra, a serpent-like monster whose peculiarity was that for every severed head, 2 new, even more ferocious ones would grow. With each strike of Heracles' sword, which lopped off one head, 2 would instantly appear in its place, creating a menacing, writhing mass of snapping jaws and deadly venom-filled fangs. And the resolution to this seemingly insoluble problem was found thanks to his nephews. They were instructed to cauterize each neck stump with a torch immediately after a head was severed, thereby preventing its regeneration. This episode was one of the rare moments when Heracles resorted to outside help during his heroic deeds. It taught him a valuable lesson. Physical strength alone is sometimes insufficient. True success also requires wisdom and the ability to cooperate. The third labour sent the hero into the mountain ranges, where he was to capture the Ceryneian hind, a deer with golden antlers, considered a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis. This task required not so much brute force as exceptional patience and unwavering persistence. Heracles had to tirelessly pursue this incredibly swift creature for a whole year, and only then did he finally manage to catch it without causing the slightest harm, which made the task many times more difficult. Each subsequent deed prescribed by Eurystheus presented new, unique challenges designed to test and develop different facets of Heracles' character. He had to capture alive the enormous Erymanthian boar, cleanse the legendary Augean stables which housed thousands of cattle and had not been cleaned for decades, drive away the bloodthirsty Stymphalian birds, tame the fire-breathing mares of Diomedes and obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, the valiant queen of the Amazons. Some of these tasks required Heracles to display diplomatic skills, which he had to acquire as he went along. Others required not so much brute physical strength as sophisticated cunning and meticulous planning. Thus, the hero who initially relied solely on his colossal strength gradually learned the art of using his mind, his heart, and his ability to interact with others. However, the most monumental and complex trials were yet to come. The 10th task involved stealing the cattle of Geryon, a three-bodied giant who resided at the westernmost edge of the known world. To reach Geryon's island, Heracles had to cross the boundless ocean. It was during this journey that he erected the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, which marked the furthest point reached in the world at that time. The 11th labour led him to the legendary Garden of the Hesperides, where he was to steal the golden apples that granted eternal life. These wondrous fruits, capable of bestowing immortality upon those who tasted them, were securely guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, nymphs whose singing accompanied their tending of the trees, but also by the 100-headed dragon named Ladon. To accomplish this extremely difficult task, Heracles needed to enlist the help of the Titan Atlas. Atlas, forever holding up the celestial vault as punishment for his participation in an ancient rebellion against the gods, agreed to fetch the apples on the condition that Heracles temporarily assume his unbearable burden. Thus, for a brief moment, Heracles found himself at the edge of the world, feeling the full weight of the heavens on his shoulders. This became a profound lesson for him about the nature of responsibility, which cannot be postponed or delegated. The 12th and final labour seemed the most impossible of all. Heracles was to descend into the gloomy realm of Hades and bring back Cerberus, the ferocious three-headed hound that perpetually guarded the gates of the underworld. No mortal had ever dared to enter Hades' abode and return, and Cerberus himself had never been subdued by either hero or monster. However, by this point Heracles had transformed, becoming an entirely different person compared to the one who, consumed by grief and guilt, had begun these labours 12 years ago. He had acquired patience, tirelessly pursuing the golden hind. He had learned diplomacy during his encounters with the Amazons, and he had gained humility when the celestial vault rested on his shoulders. When he stood before Hades and Persephone, asking permission to attempt to subdue Cerberus, his address was filled with deep respect, not his former arrogance. Hades, the lord of the underworld, agreed to grant Heracles this opportunity, but with one indispensable condition: the hero had to subdue Cerberus relying solely on his own strength, without using any weapons and without outside help. This became the culminating trial, the capstone of everything he had learned during his years of forced service. The struggle between Heracles and Cerberus, though epic in nature, was remarkably quiet. There was no furious roaring, no theatrical poses, only a patient confrontation of strength against strength, endurance against endurance. Heracles gripped the mighty neck of the enormous dog firmly and held him, despite how fiercely the creature thrashed and desperately tried to shake him off. Eventually, Cerberus realized that this man would not let go, would not give up, would not be intimidated, and would not be exhausted. And with something that could be interpreted as a display of respect, the guardian of the underworld allowed himself to be led into the world of the living. When Heracles appeared before King Eurystheus, presenting him with Cerberus, the cowardly ruler, upon merely glimpsing the three-headed monster, immediately granted Heracles his long-awaited freedom. The 12 labours were finally complete. The debt of atonement had been fully paid, and the hero was free to live his own life. However, such is the nature of tasks that truly change a person. Once they are completed, the one who completed them is never the same. Heracles, having finished his 12 labours, was significantly different from the man who, consumed by grief and guilt, had begun them 12 years prior. He had learned that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom that allows one to know when to refrain from exercising one's authority. The hero realized that the hardest battles are often fought not with external monsters, but with those aspects of one's own personality that are least sympathetic. Redemption, it turned out, is not a destination one arrives at, but rather a way of walking, a daily choice to use one's unique gifts for the benefit of something far greater than oneself. The story of the 12 labours of Heracles serves as an eternal reminder that sometimes the very trials that seem designed to destroy us actually teach us profound lessons about our true nature and who we are capable of becoming. To the question of what a person can become, Sisyphus, in his own conviction, had already given an exhaustive answer. He was unshakably confident in his ability to outwit anyone, including even the almighty gods of Olympus. His tragic story serves as a poignant reminder that there are contests where victory brings no honour, and that some triumphs are actually disguised defeats. Sisyphus, king of Corinth, was renowned throughout Hellas for his exceptional cunning and sharp intellect. Through a combination of strategic thinking and ruthless pragmatism, he not only founded his city, but also led it to prosperity. He was the type of ruler who always seemed 3 steps ahead of his opponents, invariably finding an approach or an advantage in any situation, no matter how complex. However, Sisyphus had one fatal flaw. He could not resist the irresistible temptation to display his sharp mind, even in cases where it would have been far wiser to remain silent and keep his schemes to himself. His behaviour resembled a chess master who cannot resist explaining every brilliant move to his opponent, even if it reveals his strategy. Trouble began when Sisyphus accidentally witnessed an event he should not have seen. Zeus, the almighty king of the gods, had taken the form of an eagle to abduct the beautiful river nymph Aegina. Her father, the river god Asopus, desperately searched for his vanished daughter and in his quest sought Sisyphus's help. In this situation, the most prudent course of action for Sisyphus would have been to feign ignorance. After all, what mortal ruler would want to meddle in disputes between gods? However, Sisyphus, sensing an opportunity to gain a powerful ally, could not resist the temptation to demonstrate the breadth of his knowledge. "I witnessed what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus declared to Asopus. "Zeus carried her away. But if you wish to obtain this information, I will require something in return. Create a freshwater spring for my city, and I will tell you where he took her." The deal seemed brilliant. Asopus fulfilled his part of the bargain, creating the spring. Sisyphus revealed Zeus's secret, and Corinth gained an invaluable source of water. However, Sisyphus made the classic mistake of naively believing he could manipulate forces far superior to his own with impunity. Zeus, naturally, was quite enraged to learn that a mortal king had not only betrayed his secret, but also set an angry river god upon him. He decided to teach Sisyphus a lesson about how dangerous excessive cleverness, turned against one's own good, could be. So Zeus dispatched death itself to take Sisyphus and escort him to the underworld. Yet even in the face of the inevitable fate awaiting all mortals, Sisyphus could not resist an attempt to outwit his final adversary. When Death appeared at the palace of Corinth, Sisyphus met her with feigned submission. "I suppose my time has come," he said sadly. "I'm ready to go with you. But tell me, what are these chains you carry? How exactly do they work? I have heard of their unbreakable nature, but I have never seen them so close." Death, proud of her fearsome equipment, readily began to demonstrate their function. "You see, once these chains are closed, no force in the entire universe can break them. Here, let me show you how they snap shut." And faster than Death could realize what was happening, Sisyphus deftly clasped the chains around Death herself. When Death herself was bound in her unbreakable chains, no one in the entire world could find rest in oblivion. This became a fundamental distortion of the natural order. At first, Sisyphus rejoiced, gloating over his own ingenuity. He had managed to outwit Death itself. He had accomplished an unprecedented feat, beyond the reach of any mortal. However, the unforeseen consequences of his audacious deed gradually began to manifest. Without Death, tasked with taking the old and the infirm, the universe plunged into immense suffering. People who were destined to find peace in oblivion were condemned to drag out a miserable existence in agony and disease. Warriors who fell on battlefields could not die. Therefore, they writhed helplessly from unbearable wounds, unable to heal and deprived of saving oblivion. The Olympian deities were not merely angered, they were deeply disturbed. The harmony of the entire cosmos rested on the unshakable cycle of being and passing. Without Death to balance life, the very existence of the universe was threatened with complete collapse. Finally, Ares, the god of war, appeared in Corinth with the resolve to resolve the anomaly. He freed Death from her chains and personally escorted Sisyphus to the gloomy realm of Hades. But even then, Sisyphus harbored one more cunning plan. Before descending into the underworld, he instructed his wife not to perform the customary funeral rites for him. Upon arriving at the threshold of the underworld, he immediately complained to Hades about this egregious violation of sacred laws. "My wife has brought shame upon me," Sisyphus exclaimed with feigned indignation. "She did not grant me a proper burial. How can you demand that I remain in the underworld if I was not properly escorted here according to all rules and customs?" Hades, known for his adherence to strict procedures, acknowledged the validity of this claim. He granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living for just enough time to arrange proper funeral ceremonies. However, once Sisyphus returned to Corinth, he had no intention of willingly returning to the underworld. He spent many years enjoying earthly life, boasting everywhere about how he had outsmarted death not once, but twice. In the end, of course, relentless old age finally took its toll, and when he died a natural death, there was no escaping his final fate. But by that time, the gods had decided that ordinary retribution would be insufficient for one who had caused so much trouble and shown such flagrant disregard for the natural order. Sisyphus was condemned to a special form of eternal retribution. He was to perform a task destined to last endlessly, rolling a colossal boulder up a steep hillside. However, the cunning of the sentence lay in the fact that each time he almost reached the summit, the stone would inexorably roll back down, forcing him to begin the exhausting process anew. Imagine the scene. Sisyphus presses his mighty shoulder against the colossal stone, feeling its immense weight and rough surface, beginning the slow, agonizing ascent up the mountainside. His muscles strain to their limit, his breath comes in gasps and sweat streams into his eyes. Step by step, conquering every inch, he diligently pushes the boulder ever higher up the slope. As he climbs, he watches the hilltop gradually draw nearer. A timid hope awakens in his heart that this time things will be different, that this time he will truly succeed in getting the stone to the very top. He exerts even more effort, ignoring the piercing pain in his back and shoulders, concentrating all his remaining energy on those last few feet. And just at the moment when success seems imminent, the boulder suddenly breaks free from his control and tumbles crashingly back down. He has to watch as his arduous labour comes to naught. He has to accept that all his titanic efforts were in vain. He must begin the entire process from the very beginning. The punishment was perfectly suited to the very essence of Sisyphus's character. All his life he had been obsessed with winning, with surpassing others with his intellect, and with performing deeds inaccessible to others. Now he was confined within a task where triumph was unattainable, where cunning was useless, and his sharp mind gave him absolutely no advantage. But this is where the narrative takes a completely unexpected turn. After countless ages of continuously rolling his boulder, some transformation occurred within Sisyphus himself. He began to discover a strange serenity in this endless repetition, a certain rhythm that bordered on meditation. He started noticing details that had previously escaped his attention, how the light changed on the hillside throughout the day, how small wild flowers bloomed among the stones, how his muscles worked in harmonious coordination, moving the massive stone. His pride now lay not in reaching the summit, which he knew perfectly well was impossible, but in the quality of the effort expended, in the unwavering steadfastness of his resolve. A number of thinkers and philosophers have speculated that in his eternal, monotonous task, Sisyphus grasped something that had eluded him throughout his cunning and intriguing life. The satisfaction that comes not from outwitting one's neighbour or achieving unthinkable triumphs, but from simply, honourably, and persistently performing one's duty, regardless of the final outcome. Perhaps the true punishment was not so much the endless toil as the realization of what his life could have been if he had earlier learned to find deep meaning in the process itself, rather than obsessively focusing solely on the results. Or perhaps this punishment gradually transformed into a kind of gift, a chance to realize that even in the seemingly most hopeless situation, one can find purpose and even achieve deep satisfaction. The legend of Sisyphus serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the very qualities we believe elevate us above others. Our ingenuity, our tendency to seek loopholes and detours, our unwavering determination to win at any cost, can become the sources of our deepest suffering. And sometimes it is precisely those tasks that seem most meaningless that turn out to be the ones that teach us the most valuable lessons about what truly matters. Each of us has our own boulders to push, our own hills to climb, our own tasks that seem to restart just as we begin to believe we're making progress. The question is not so much whether we will succeed in the way we originally envisioned, but whether we can find a way to push our stone with dignity, with unwavering purpose, and perhaps even with joy. To find joy in seemingly impossible circumstances was something Daedalus understood better than many others. However, his own story vividly demonstrates that sometimes the very solutions we devise to overcome our difficulties can become the source of even deeper tragedy. His narrative is a saga of genius and love, of innovation and loss, and of the heavy burden of unforeseen consequences. Daedalus was, without a doubt, the greatest inventor and most skilled craftsman who ever walked the earth. His clever hands could shape any material into whatever his boundless creative mind could imagine. He created mechanical servants capable of performing the most intricate tasks, fountains that played melodious music as water flowed, and sculptures so realistic that people spoke to them, expecting a reply. His workshop was a true marvel, filled with half-finished projects and brilliant innovations. Gears and pulleys hung from the ceiling, alongside meticulously detailed blueprints for flying machines. Workbenches were covered with models of buildings defying traditional architectural canons, devices capable of measuring the passage of time or predicting weather phenomena, and toys that moved on their own, as if they were living creatures. However, Daedalus's greatest creation was neither a complex machine nor a magnificent building. It was his son, Icarus. Not literally, of course, but he was shaped and nurtured by years of patient instruction and gentle guidance. Icarus inherited his father's insatiable curiosity and sharp mind, though he lacked the patience and wisdom of a more mature man. One can vividly imagine them working together in the workshop. Daedalus would show his son how to join pieces of wood so they would never come apart, how to temper metal to achieve perfect sharpness, how to observe birds in flight, understanding the principles that kept them aloft. Icarus listened with deep attention, his young face serious with concentration, and asked an endless stream of questions about why things worked the way they did. Their measured and peaceful life was disrupted when the ruler of Crete, King Minos, summoned Daedalus to his court. The monarch had a serious problem. His wife had given birth to a monstrous creature known as the Minotaur, a half-human, half-bull being, and he needed a secure place to imprison it. Not to kill it, it should be noted, but to confine it in a dungeon where it could not terrorize his subjects, yet still be able to continue its existence. Daedalus designed and built a labyrinth, so incredibly complex and intricate that anyone who dared to enter it would inevitably get lost without any hope of escape. Winding passages twisted and turned back on themselves, led to dead ends, opened into chambers that seemed to offer a path to salvation, but in reality only led deeper into the heart of the labyrinth. In its very centre, the Minotaur resided in a kind of peaceful confinement, fed and cared for, but utterly unable to find its way out. This labyrinth was a true masterpiece of engineering and profound psychology, taking into account not only the physical difficulty of navigation, but also the mental consequences of prolonged confusion and disorientation. Its design was conceived so that it would be not only utterly impenetrable, but also to gradually cause anyone trapped within it to lose all hope of finding freedom. For several years, Daedalus and his son Icarus lived in Crete, in relative comfort. As honoured guests of King Minos, Daedalus tirelessly continued his work, creating ever new inventions and solving complex problems for the royal court. Icarus, meanwhile, grew from a boy into a young man, mastering his father's skills while also developing his own interests and talents. However, the course of events suddenly took a different turn, radically altering the situation. The legendary hero Theseus arrived on the island of Crete and, with the help of the king's daughter Ariadne, not only successfully navigated the intricate corridors of the labyrinth, but also slew the formidable Minotaur, after which he safely departed the island. King Minos was consumed by furious anger, caused not only by the loss of his monstrous charge, but also by the bitter realization that his seemingly impregnable and perfect prison had been defeated. In a fit of this rage, Minos laid all the blame for the labyrinth's failure on Daedalus. How else, he reasoned, could Theseus have succeeded if the labyrinth's creator himself had not revealed his secrets? This accusation was, of course, unfair. Daedalus had absolutely nothing to do with Theseus's triumph, but justice was not a priority for King Minos when he was overcome by anger. As a harsh retribution, King Minos ordered Daedalus and his son Icarus to be imprisoned in a tall tower located on a tiny island off the Cretan coast. This tower was a secluded structure surrounded on all sides by the sea, where there was no boat that could offer a path to freedom, no hope of swimming to shore. The ruler was certain that even the ingenious inventor Daedalus would not be able to find a way out of such an impregnable prison. For many weeks, father and son languished in the confinement of this tower, subsisting on meagre food brought to them only once a day. They watched the majestic cycle of the sun rising and setting beyond their single window, and a troubling premonition grew in their hearts that they were destined to spend the rest of their days in captivity. Daedalus, deep in thought, spent hours studying the birds that nested in the walls of their stone prison. He carefully observed how the feathered creatures expertly used their wings to glide on air currents, how they could remain aloft for hours without showing visible signs of fatigue. Icarus, unlike his father, found imprisonment difficult. Being young and full of energy, he was accustomed to constant activity, to participating in various projects and the process of learning. The enforced idleness proved to be almost more agonizing for him than the deprivation of freedom itself. He incessantly paced the cramped cell, gazed for hours at the endless blue beyond the window, and constantly bombarded his father with questions about when they would be free and how they would escape. And so, on one of those endless silent days, an epiphany struck Daedalus, as if lightning had pierced his mind. His gaze fell upon a seagull gracefully soaring outside their prison window, barely moving its wings as it rose on an updraft of warm air emanating from the sun-heated stones below. Suddenly, with astonishing clarity, he understood what he had to do. "We cannot leave this place by foot," he said to Icarus, "and we cannot sail away, but there is one path Minos could not block, the boundless sky." Using the meagre materials they could find within their cell and the tower itself, Daedalus began to construct 2 pairs of wings. He meticulously gathered feathers shed by the birds that had made their nests directly in the stone walls. This collection included both the softest downy feathers and long, strong flight feathers, intended to provide the necessary lift and control in flight. The construction process proved to be an exceptionally painstaking task, demanding all of Daedalus's outstanding craftsmanship and boundless patience. Each individual feather had to be positioned with jeweler's precision, secured with threads extracted from their worn clothing and wax melted from the candles that served as their only source of light in their gloomy cell. These artificial wings had to be both light enough to allow flight, yet strong enough to bear the weight of a human body. They needed flexibility to respond sensitively to air currents, but also sufficient rigidity to ensure stable lift. Icarus, of course, assisted as best he could in the creation process, but it was evident that his young heart was not fully engaged in this cautious and methodical work. He was consumed by a passionate desire to try the wings as soon as possible, to experience them in action, to know the incomparable freedom of flight. While his father meticulously double-checked every joint and tested every element of the design, Icarus dreamed of soaring high above the island, of feeling the wind caress beneath his wings, of the indescribable thrill of escaping their confinement by air. When the wings finally took their completed form, Daedalus spent an entire day teaching his son the art of controlling them. Right on the floor of their cramped cell, they practiced hand movements designed to create lift, learned to shift their center of gravity for turns, and recognized the signs indicating wind direction. "Remember," Daedalus tirelessly repeated, "fly at a moderate height, not too low, so the sea spray doesn't soak your wings and weigh them down, but also not too high. The hot sun can melt the wax binding the feathers. Stay close to me, follow my instructions, and don't give in to the urge to show off or be overly clever. Our goal is survival, not adventure." Icarus nodded vigorously, promising firmly to follow all his father's instructions precisely. However, even in the moment of these promises, his eyes clearly held barely contained excitement, an impatient anticipation of experiencing something no mortal before him had. The morning they chose for their daring escape proved truly ideal for flying. The sky was clear, a moderate wind blew, and visibility in all directions was excellent. Daedalus, with paternal care, helped his son attach the wings, meticulously checking each connection once more, and then donned his own. For a moment, they stood together at the window of their tower, father and son, preparing to perform an act that defied all known laws of nature. The first moments of flight were truly magical. The wings functioned exactly as Daedalus had designed, deftly catching air currents and lifting them upward, away from the tower that had served as their prison. Below, the island of Crete spread out like a detailed map, with its picturesque harbours and bustling towns, majestic mountains and green valleys, all appeared peaceful and miniature from their elevated vantage point. Icarus burst into laughter from pure, unadulterated joy, feeling his body soar through the air. It was a freedom surpassing anything he had ever imagined. The ability to move anywhere, to see the world from an entirely new perspective, to move in 3 dimensions rather than being chained to the earth like all other mortals who had ever lived. For a while, everything proceeded strictly according to plan. Father and son flew confidently away from Crete, maintaining a moderate altitude and following the route Daedalus had meticulously planned during their weeks of confinement. Below them, small islands, fishing boats, and merchant ships passed, their crews pointing in amazement at the unusual flyers. However, gradually, excitement and exhilaration began to overpower Icarus's caution. The sensation of flight was so incredible, so intoxicating, that the youth yearned to experience it in its entirety. He began to experiment, climbing higher, descending lower, performing turns and even loops that his father had never taught him. Daedalus cried out desperate warnings, trying to get his son's attention, reminding him of the mortal dangers of flying both too high and too low. But his voice, alas, was lost in the sound of the wind, and Icarus was too absorbed in the euphoria of flight to pay attention to anything else. Higher and higher Icarus soared, drawn by the alluring warmth of the sun and the incredible landscapes that opened before him with every gained altitude. The world below became a colourful patchwork of blue, green, and brown hues, beautiful beyond description. The youth felt he could see endlessly, as if the secrets of the earth, incomprehensible to any mortal, were being revealed to him. In his unrestrained rapture, Icarus completely failed to notice how the wax binding his wings began to soften under the scorching rays of the sun. The feathers started to loosen, and then, one by one, to detach and be carried away by the wind. By the time the youth realized what was happening, it was irrecoverably too late. The wings that had so triumphantly carried him into the sky began to disintegrate rapidly. Feathers scattered in the wind like snowflakes, and suddenly Icarus felt himself plummeting, deprived of the support of the artificial wings so painstakingly crafted by his father. Daedalus, flying considerably lower, looked up at that very moment to witness his son's terrifying fall into the sea. He was utterly powerless. There was no way to fly fast enough to catch him, no way to repair the damaged wings in mid-air. There was no way to prevent the tragedy unfolding directly above him. Icarus plunged into the azure waters of the Aegean Sea, and the waves silently closed over him, as if the youth had never existed. The only traces of his recent presence were a few scattered feathers, bobbing on the surface, and a father's heart-wrenching cry, full of unbearable grief, echoing through the silent sky. Daedalus landed on a nearby islet, carefully removed his wings, and spent long days tirelessly searching the shoreline in hopes of finding some trace of his son. Eventually, Icarus's lifeless body was washed ashore by the waves, and Daedalus buried him with his own hands, erecting a humble monument to mark the place where the first man to dare to fly returned to earth. The narrative of Daedalus and Icarus serves as a powerful reminder that any given talent is inextricably linked to responsibility, and every freedom gained always has its limits. What can save us, be it our sharp intellect, boundless creativity, or extraordinary courage, can just as easily destroy us if we do not show due respect for its power and do not recognize its limits. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when we struggle with our own limitations, but when we have just broken free from them and feel that all possibilities are open to us. It is at such moments that we most need wisdom, and it is then that it becomes especially difficult to remember that even the boundless sky has its boundaries, crossing which we expose ourselves to the greatest risk. The boundaries we sometimes cross at the moment of decision often seem utterly insignificant, like a simple choice between three magnificent gifts. Yet they can set in motion a chain of events that will fundamentally alter the entire world. This statement is undoubtedly true for a young shepherd named Paris, who made a decision that seemed easy enough at the time, but ultimately provoked the launching of 1,000 ships and led to the fall of 2 great cities. Paris was not meant to make fateful decisions. Moreover, he was not meant to live at all. When he was born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, the royal seers prophesied that this infant would one day be the cause of the great city's destruction. The prophecy was so terrifying and so specific that the king and queen felt they had no choice but to order the newborn's death. However, the servant tasked with carrying out this grim command could not bring himself to take the innocent child's life. Instead, he left Paris on the slopes of Mount Ida, secretly hoping that the elements of nature would do what he lacked the heart to do himself. It was meant to be a more merciful end than outright murder, but death nonetheless. However, contrary to the grim predictions, Paris did not meet his demise. His fate took a different turn. The infant was discovered and taken in by shepherds living on the mountain slopes. These simple, unpretentious people were far removed from the intrigues of the royal court and paid no heed to ominous prophecies. They raised the boy as their own son, teaching him all the wisdom of the shepherd's craft, how to watch over sheep, predict changes in weather, find shelter during a storm, and lead a modest, unadorned life. For 20 years, Paris lived in serene ignorance of his true origins. He sincerely believed himself to be an ordinary shepherd's son, and was perfectly content with this humble existence. His days were spent tending flocks of sheep and goats, playing his flute to the accompaniment of grazing animals. He spent his nights under the starry sky when the weather was favourable, or sought refuge in simple huts when storms swept through the mountain slopes. It was a life devoid of luxury, but also free from the heavy burdens and responsibilities that inevitably accompany power. Paris, hardened by outdoor labour, possessed a sturdy physique and an attractive appearance, typical of young people leading a healthy and active lifestyle. He was also endowed with a natural charm that made both animals and people instinctively trust him. Then, one day, as Paris was tending his flocks on the peaceful high meadow of Ida, 3 majestic figures suddenly appeared before him. They were certainly not shepherds, nor travellers, nor anyone else one would expect to encounter in such a remote corner. These were the 3 most powerful goddesses of the Greek pantheon: Hera, the majestic queen of the gods and patroness of marriage; Athena, the wise goddess of war and strategic art; and Aphrodite, the embodiment of love and beauty. Each of them was incomparably magnificent, surpassing all human description, and radiated such power and divine majesty that they could not be mistaken for mortals. However, despite their undeniable grandeur, the 3 goddesses seemed to be in the midst of a fierce argument. Their voices were sharp and tense, and their gestures energetic, as each tried to assert her point of view, which the others clearly did not wish to hear. The cause of their disagreement was a golden apple, which Hera held in her hand. Inscribed on it was "To the fairest," and it had been tossed among them at a wedding feast by Eris, the goddess of discord, who was greatly angered at not being invited to the celebration. Each goddess naturally considered herself the most beautiful, and therefore the rightful owner of the apple. However, none of them wished to yield to the others, and their dispute dragged on so long that it began to threaten the harmony of Olympus itself. Finally, Zeus decided to intervene, but not to resolve the dispute himself, which would have required him to choose between his own wife, daughter, and sister. Instead, he decided to delegate this difficult decision to a mortal judge, who could not be accused of divine favoritism. You, Hera pronounced, pointing to Paris, who still stood with his mouth agape, trying to comprehend what was happening. You will decide which of us deserves this apple. Paris looked from one goddess to another, and his shepherd's common sense told him that this was precisely the situation a wise man would try to avoid. How could one choose between three beings capable of destroying you, with a single thought if they disliked your decision? I am merely a shepherd, Paris stammered faintly. Surely someone more qualified. The decision is made, Athena interrupted. Zeus himself has chosen you as judge. You cannot refuse. What followed was less a competition than a series of increasingly tempting offers, bordering on bribery. Each goddess, realizing that this humble shepherd possessed incredible power over their eternal reputations, began to offer him gifts capable of transforming his simple life beyond recognition. Hera spoke first, her voice carrying all the power and authority of her position as Queen of the Gods. "Choose me," she said, "and I will make you ruler of all Europe and Asia. You will command countless armies, rule great cities, and be remembered as one of the greatest kings who ever lived. No mortal will be able to defy your will." This was truly an incredible offer. Paris could vividly imagine himself in golden armor, standing before the gates of conquered cities, accepting the submission of defeated enemies. He saw himself enacting laws, commissioning magnificent works of art and architecture, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for millennia. But before he could reply, Athena stepped forward. "Power without wisdom is meaningless and breeds chaos," she declared. "Choose me, and I will grant you wisdom surpassing that of any mortal, and victory in every battle you ever wage. You will be invincible in war, unparalleled in strategy, and will be remembered not merely as a conqueror, but as the most discerning and sagacious ruler who ever lived." This offer was even more enticing than Hera's. What good is power if you don't know how to wield it wisely? What good is ruling if you make unwise decisions that bring suffering to your people? With Athena's gifts, Paris could become not just successful, but truly great and revered leader. But then Aphrodite smiled, and her smile was like the first rays of the sun breaking through thick clouds after a prolonged storm. "My sisters offer you things that will bring you only burdens and heavy responsibilities," she said softly. "Choose me, and I will give you something far simpler and immeasurably more precious: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen of Sparta will be yours, and with her will come a happiness that no power or wisdom can provide." Paris, of course, had heard of Helen. Even simple shepherds knew stories of the Spartan queen, whose beauty was so extraordinary that it seemed almost supernatural, divine. Poets composed hymns of praise about her. Artists fruitlessly tried to capture her image on their canvases, and young men throughout Greece dreamed of merely catching a glimpse of her. The choice, it seemed, should have been obvious. Power and wisdom, though impressive, brought with them obligations and complexities. Helen, on the other hand, embodied love in its purest form, the joy of meeting someone who completes you, who makes every day brighter simply by their existence. Paris at that moment did not consider that Helen was already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. He did not ponder what might happen when the most beautiful woman in the world disappeared from her homeland. He did not question why Aphrodite could even make such an offer, or what the true price of this gift might be. His thoughts were consumed only by love, beauty, and the happiness that seemed to shine in Aphrodite's eyes, like a promise of everything he had never dared to hope for. "I choose Aphrodite," Paris declared, and handed her the golden apple. The consequences of this decision were immediate and truly catastrophic. Hera and Athena, enraged by the refusal, became implacable enemies of Paris and in essence enemies of Troy itself. They immediately began to devise cunning plans to destroy the city that had produced this shepherd, who dared to deem them inferior to the goddess of love. Aphrodite, true to her word, arranged for Paris to travel to Sparta, where he was received as an honoured guest by King Menelaus. During his stay, Helen fell deeply in love with the handsome young visitor, just as the goddess had promised. However, love created by divine magic differs from love that naturally arises between two people. It is more intense, more overwhelming, and less concerned with consequences or obligations. Helen left her husband, her daughter, and her kingdom to sail with Paris to Troy, never once looking back at what she was leaving behind. When Menelaus discovered that his wife had been abducted by his Trojan guest, his grief and rage knew no bounds, but he did not grieve alone. Helen had been courted by virtually every prince and king of Greece before she married Menelaus, and all her former suitors had sworn an oath to protect her marriage and assist her husband if anyone ever tried to take her away. This oath, which at the time seemed merely a formality, now became the foundation of the greatest military alliance the ancient world had ever seen. One by one, the kings and heroes of Greece fulfilled their obligation, assembling vast armies and fleets for what would later be known as the Trojan War. For 10 long years the Greeks besieged Troy, and the war, begun by Paris's simple choice, consumed an entire generation. Heroes perished on the battlefields, prosperous cities were razed to the ground, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of civilization in the eastern Mediterranean was shredded. In the end, Troy fell, as the ancient prophecy had foretold. King Priam was killed, Queen Hecuba enslaved, and the great city, which had stood for centuries, was reduced to smoking ruins. Paris himself died in battle, struck down by an arrow that found him just as he began to understand the true cost of the choice he had made on that peaceful meadow so many years ago. The story of the judgment of Paris serves as an eternal reminder that some choices, which at the moment seem simple and purely personal, can have consequences extending far beyond anything we could have imagined. When we make decisions guided only by immediate desires and without considering the broader implications of our actions, we risk unleashing forces capable of destroying not only ourselves, but also everyone around us. Sometimes the most important thing about a choice is not what we gain from it, but what we are willing to sacrifice, and whether we have considered what that sacrifice might cost other people who never had a say in our decision. The voices of those who suffer due to others' decisions echo unceasingly through the ages, and nowhere is this more vividly and tragically embodied than in the culminating phase of the Trojan War, when the city, which had resisted a decade-long siege unbreakably, finally fell, not through valor in open combat or unyielding courage, but through a skillful, cunning stratagem that prompts deep reflection on the true value of triumph, gained by deceit rather than honest struggle. By the 10th year of the war, which Paris had unwittingly provoked, exhaustion gripped both warring sides. For a decade, the Greeks had pitched their temporary camps on the coastal sands outside Troy's walls, agonizingly separated from their homes and loved ones, inexorably aging under a foreign sky while waging a seemingly endless military campaign. The Trojans, for just as long, had been trapped behind their impregnable city fortifications, watching their food reserves steadily dwindle and their young men perish in a series of fierce battles. The legendary heroes who had lent the early years of the conflict such vivid and tragic colour had, for the most part, already found their graves. The indomitable Achilles, the invincible warrior, had fallen, struck down by Paris's arrow, precisely hitting his only vulnerable point, his heel. Hector, the valiant defender of Troy, its unshakable pillar, had been vanquished by Achilles, eager to avenge the death of his loyal friend Patroclus. The mighty Ajax had taken his own life, unable to bear a fit of madness brought on by dishonour. Even Paris himself, the unwitting cause of all this bloodshed, had faded into oblivion, his demise merely a pale entry in the extensive list of great losses. What remained were exhausted, greying, middle-aged warriors whose sole desire was to return home, led by commanders who had invested too much effort, time, and reputation in this conflict to simply retreat, but whose initial motives and convictions about the advisability of the fight had long since faded from memory. The Greek camp gradually transformed into a kind of semi-permanent settlement of tents and temporary structures, with established markets, functioning workshops, and even its own, albeit temporary, social hierarchy. Men who had arrived here as young, vigorous warriors were now grizzled veterans, with children at home whose faces they had never seen. Some had died of disease or tragic accidents, others from wounds that, in the unsanitary conditions and hardships of camp life, had never properly healed. Inside Troy, the situation was even more dire. The city, once prosperous and proud, now literally choked with refugees from surrounding lands. Each sought refuge behind the mighty walls that had become for them both a reliable defence and a merciless prison. Food was distributed by strict rationing, fuel resources were catastrophically depleted, and over it all hung the oppressive awareness that enemies were very close, outside the walls, tirelessly waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. King Priam had aged immeasurably and withered during the years of siege. A man once full of energy and resolute authority, he was now crushed by sorrow and exhaustion, having lost so many of his sons that at times his memory failed to distinguish which of them was still alive. Queen Hecuba glided through the palace halls like an ethereal ghost, her face reflecting the unbearable weight of watching her kin and her beloved city slowly perish around her. However, despite the depth of their suffering, the Trojan people did not bow their heads to the enemy. Their indestructible walls still stood unblemished. The surviving warriors continued to fight valiantly, and their spirit, though severely battered, remained unbroken. As long as these mighty fortifications remained impregnable, Troy could resist for as long as necessary, thereby preventing the Greeks from claiming the full and definitive victory for which they had made such countless sacrifices. It was Odysseus, the renowned king of Ithaca, and the most cunning of all Greek commanders, who ultimately devised a strategy to resolve this protracted stalemate. For many months he meticulously analysed the situation, seeking a way for Greek warriors to enter the city, bypassing a direct assault on its impregnable fortifications. And when the solution struck him, it was strikingly elegant in its simplicity. Instead of exhausting forces in futile attempts to breach Troy by force of arms, why not resort to deception, so that the Trojans themselves, of their own free will, would let the Greek warriors inside? Odysseus put forth the idea of constructing a colossal wooden horse, hollow inside and massive enough to hold a select detachment of Greek warriors. This horse would be presented to the Trojans as a sacred offering, a gift to the deities, intended to ensure the Greeks a safe return home after they had supposedly abandoned their decade-long siege. Odysseus's strategy implied that the Greeks would completely evacuate their camp, sailing away under cover of night, thereby simulating a definitive admission of defeat. The next morning the Trojans would discover the beach completely deserted, save for the mysterious wooden horse and perhaps a single Greek warrior, specially left behind to explain its true, as he would relate, purpose. The construction of this monumental effigy took several weeks. Greek carpenters and skilled engineers worked on it in strictest secrecy, making it large enough to give the impression of a majestic religious offering, yet equipped with a hidden compartment capable of holding 30 of their elite warriors. The horse was designed to be a true masterpiece of craftsmanship, a kind of gift that it was supposed the gods might genuinely appreciate. Once the horse was completed, Odysseus set about selecting the warriors who were to hide inside it. His choice fell upon those who were not only experienced fighters, but also possessed exceptional composure and strong nerves, capable of maintaining absolute silence and stillness for many hours without interruption. These chosen few were to endure being sealed inside the wooden structure, deprived of the ability to observe what was happening outside, and relying entirely on the success of the entire scheme as a guarantee of their own survival. On the appointed night, the Greek army broke camp and embarked on their ships, sailing into the impenetrable darkness, creating the complete illusion that they had finally given up their 10-year siege. However, their path was not towards their homeland. Instead, they anchored behind the cover of a nearby island, patiently awaiting a prearranged signal that would herald the success of their cunning deception. When the first rays of dawn illuminated ancient Troy, the first thing that struck the sentries was an unusual silence. For a decade they had grown accustomed to the constant noise of the Greek camp, the clang of weapons, the din of soldiers, the swirling smoke from campfires. Now there was nothing but the rhythmic whisper of waves caressing the deserted beach. With the utmost caution, several Trojan scouts dared to leave the city walls to investigate. What met their gaze seemed too incredible to be true. The Greek camp was utterly empty, only scattered debris serving as silent testimony that life had once thrived there. However, on the deserted shore stood a colossal wooden horse, artfully crafted and, to all appearances, intended as some special offering. Near the gigantic horse, the scouts discovered a solitary Greek soldier named Sinon, who appeared to have been abandoned by his retreating comrades. After interrogation, Sinon recounted a carefully rehearsed story of how the Greeks had finally decided to abandon their arduous siege and go home. But first they wished to make an offering to ensure a safe sea voyage. The horse, Sinon explained, was dedicated to the goddess Athena, and was deliberately built so large that it could not pass through the gates of Troy. The Greeks, he claimed, hoped that the Trojans would attempt to bring it into the city, thereby angering the goddess and bringing her wrath upon Troy. By leaving the horse outside, the Trojans would ensure their safety, and the Greeks would earn Athena's favour for their return home. It was indeed a sophisticated story, artfully calculated to induce the Trojans to do precisely what the Greeks hoped. By subtly hinting at the danger of bringing the horse inside, Sinon presented it as an act of wisdom and valour, bravely defying the expectations of the cunning Greeks. For many hours the Trojans debated fiercely about the fate of this unusual gift. Some, including the perceptive priest Laocoon, vehemently argued that it was undoubtedly a trick, and the horse should be immediately destroyed. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," Laocoon loudly warned, trying to appeal to his fellow citizens' reason. However, his warnings were tragically ignored when he and his sons were strangled by giant sea serpents, which many interpreted as an undeniable sign of divine displeasure at his sceptical words. Others, conversely, fiercely defended the view that the horse undoubtedly represented a most valuable religious artifact, which should be ceremoniously brought into the city and consecrated in one of the Trojan temples. After all, if the Greeks had truly admitted defeat and sailed away, what harm could there be in taking their abandoned offering, which, moreover, could become a powerful symbol of their victory? Ultimately, overwhelming curiosity and the long-awaited hope for peace triumphed over sound caution. The Trojans made the fateful decision to bring the horse into the heart of their city, even though this required them to partially dismantle their own gates and sections of the walls, the very unbreakable fortifications that had faithfully protected them. For 10 long years, this laborious process took up most of the daylight hours. The horse was so enormous that teams of powerful oxen were required to transport it through the city streets, and jubilant crowds gathered to gaze with delight at this exotic trophy of their imagined victory. Children excitedly ran around the massive wooden structure, while adults reverently reached out to touch it, as if contact with this tangible symbol of Greek defeat could somehow miraculously make their long-awaited triumph even more tangible and real. That night, Troy indulged in a celebration it had not known for a full decade. The gates, which had remained locked for 10 long years, were flung wide open. Wine, previously meticulously rationed, flowed freely, and the inhabitants danced in the streets until utter exhaustion finally sent them to their beds. But inside the belly of the wooden horse, 30 Greek warriors waited in absolute, oppressive silence, listening as the sounds of jubilant celebration gradually faded, replaced by deep, serene sleep. When the warriors were certain that the city was deep in slumber, they cautiously opened the secret panel that served as their exit. One by one, the Greek soldiers silently descended from their hiding place and made their way through the silent, sleeping city to the gates. There they effortlessly overcame a few drowsy guards and gave the prearranged signal to their comrades, who were waiting on ships beyond the nearby island. The Greek army, which the Trojans believed had sailed away forever, surged back, pouring through the gates opened for them by their hidden comrades. By the time most Trojans realized the full horror of what was happening, their great city was irrevocably lost. What followed was not a heroic battle, but a bloody, merciless massacre. The Greeks, overflowing with 10 years of frustration, accumulated pain and grief, showed no mercy to a people who had cost them so many years and countless lives. They mercilessly killed not only warriors attempting to resist, but also defenseless civilians who had nothing to do with either the beginning or the prolongation of this war. The aged King Priam was coldly murdered right at the altar of Zeus, where he futilely sought refuge. Queen Hecuba was condemned to slavery, forced to watch in horror the complete destruction of everything she had ever loved and cherished. The prophetess Cassandra, who had foreseen the fall of Troy but whose prophecies no one heeded, was dragged by force from the temple where she had sought protection. The city, which had stood for centuries, was engulfed in flames in a single night. The seemingly impregnable fortress walls were methodically dismantled, stone by stone. Sacred temples were mercilessly plundered, majestic palaces turned into heaps of rubble, and the dwellings of ordinary citizens became ashen ruins. With the dawn, no trace of Troy remained. It was not merely defeated, it was utterly destroyed, wiped from the face of the earth as if it had never existed in human history. The saga of the Trojan horse serves as a poignant reminder that sometimes the greatest triumphs are achieved not through a display of might or unparalleled courage, but by exploiting the opponent's predisposition to wishful thinking, ignoring what they ought to fear. It was the Trojans themselves who let destruction within their walls, consumed by an irresistible desire to believe that their prolonged nightmare had finally ended. This story also vividly demonstrates that the means used to achieve success are almost as fundamentally important as the victory itself. The Greeks undoubtedly prevailed in their confrontation, yet their victory was obtained at the cost of cunning deceit and treacherous betrayal. And this sense of emptiness, inherent in such a triumph, echoed darkly in their tales, passed down through generations. At times, when a desired goal is achieved by methods that evoke a frank sense of shame or discomfort, one realizes that the success attained does not possess the luster originally attributed to it. But perhaps the most profound and comprehensive lesson is this: all wars, regardless of their origins or the ultimate victor, invariably lead to ordinary citizens being forced to bear the heavy burden of paying for decisions made by influential figures in the distant past and in remote places. The fall of Troy was not merely the end of a protracted military confrontation. It signified the complete annihilation of an entire community, a rich culture, and thousands of unique human lives. And these lives, entirely uninvolved in the fateful choice made by Paris on that meadow on Mount Ida, were nonetheless wholly consumed by its horrifying consequences.